Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this late in the evening. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dave Thomas from Deloitte and Danny Holloway from Immuta, who are going to be speaking to us about security and governance. We always say security should be at the forefront of a project, but here we scheduled it at the end of the day. So I don't know, somebody didn't get the memo. So in any case, welcome, guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks, appreciate it. And thanks for coming. Really excited to be here. As we were reflecting on our time slot, it reminded me of the upcoming 4th of July weekend. This is the last thing that I have between that and celebrating. And I was remembering as a kid going to see the 4th of July fireworks, and every time a couple fireworks went off right next to each other, I'd lean into my mom and say, "Is it here yet? Is it here yet?" And finally, they'd all go off at once, and it was the grand finale. And so here you guys are, you made it, it's the grand finale of the conference. So really appreciate you spending it with us here today. And Danny, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely, thanks Dave. So I'm Danny Holloway, I'm the CTO for public sector at Immuta. We are working on automating secure access to data and really excited to talk about some of the lessons learned and cultural practices that we've adopted in rolling out data security frameworks for our federal customers.
And I'm Dave Thomas. I'm a principal in Deloitte. I'm one of the leaders in our AI and data practice, and I focus primarily on data ops. And so when we say data ops, what does that really mean? It means driving value, driving a data value chain incrementally but continually with our clients. And one of the best ways we can drive that value is by sharing the data. So that's what we'll talk a little bit about here today. How do we drive that value by sharing the data? And I work across all of our sectors, so civilian, health, defense, security, justice, state and local. And so the lessons that we've taken away from implementing these solutions really apply across the board. So we'll sort of talk about a number of the challenges we've seen, but you can really apply it anywhere. And so we will talk a little bit more about some of the challenges and some of the tactical things that agencies are weighing when they're thinking about how to share data. And then we'll talk about some of the reasons why sharing data is so important. And then Danny's going to talk a little bit about some of the ways we can make it easier, because it's not an easy thing. And then finally we'll chat a little bit about when you go through that, what are the outcomes you enable. So first, why share data? And I was on a run this morning, and I love running in San Francisco. Every time I come here, I go for a run. But it struck me as I was running that I had heard the news about increased homelessness in the city, and it was really real as I went on my run this morning. And as I was running, I was thinking, as a public sector guy, well, this is a public sector problem. How do we solve this problem? And I began to thinking about the data. What are the types of analytics we'd want to pull together? And it struck me that the data comes from all sorts of different agencies, right? So there's obviously security concerns, there's health and human services data, there's economic data, housing data, mental health data. And in order to really make a difference in this challenge, agencies from across the spectrum really need to share that data. And then continuing to think about it, though, the data we're talking about is unbelievably sensitive. So you're talking about health data and personally identifiable information and law enforcement data, and in some cases employment data or housing data. And so to get all that data together, you really have to respect all of the different stakeholders in that. So the individuals themselves, the people who are sharing the data, you want to make sure that your data that's been collected for one use may be appropriate in certain situations, but not appropriate to share in others. So health data is a great example, right? And so that's just an example of all the different places where missions are continuing to expand and crossing what have been organizational boundaries and really require agencies to come together to share data in order to make some of these differences. I think the other thing that's really struck me over the past couple of days here at the conference is the changes in the technical landscape as well. So as we look at the new technologies, when sharing data, even just a few years ago, it would mean attaching a spreadsheet to an email and sending it to somebody, Or maybe if you're really fancy, you'd have an FTP site and you uploaded it with a cron job or something like that. And it just doesn't work anymore. The scale with which we share data, technologies like delta sharing, or these agencies are building these massive data lakes, these massive data warehouses, the lake houses, et cetera. And the way people are consuming data has changed as well. Analysts don't want a spreadsheet that's already been processed. They want the raw data. If you're doing machine learning on the data, you don't want it cleaned. You want to get to the raw and you want to build your own features. And I thought about a number of the ways we used to talk about data sharing in the DoD and the intelligence community, and it was always need to know, right? So if someone asked for data, if you didn't know that they had a need to know, you go and ask somebody, and it was human adjudicated need to know, and that was the speed at which we were exchanging data, and it just doesn't work anymore. The scale is too big, the types of data we need is too big, and the speed with which we need to share it is too big. And it's not always even person to person. Often it's machine to machine. And so how do you implement policies that enable us to enforce it regardless of how data is being consumed, and not just handed over through an email or a spreadsheet? And of course, the consequences of getting it wrong are very real, they're very tangible, and people understand those really well. And sometimes the benefit of sharing data can be a little bit ephemeral, right? So especially when you're thinking about data analytics and data science, right? Data science, hypothesis testing. If we bring this data together, we might get some insight that can make a difference in this mission. So you're constantly weighing the hypothetical benefits against the real and tangible costs of sharing data, right? So data could get out of control. Someone could share it again to someone who's not supposed to. Maybe you've crossed an authority, a boundary of authorities, and you're sharing data to a part of an agency that shouldn't be able to see it. And so there's all these real, PII getting out, personal health data getting out, and the trust that all of the citizens have in government is a real issue as well. So if they think data has been shared for one reason and it gets used for something else, the erosion of trust can't be rebuilt, and so we really need to pay attention to that. And this is actually an example where I think the federal government has been ahead of the private sector for a while. Starting to see things like GDPR or the California Consumer Privacy Act. I noticed here when I flew into California, I got a different notice on pop-ups on my phone. I guess I hadn't been since that law got passed, so I had to figure out what were my answers, which I usually don't share anything. And it was Amazon, I think just a little bit ago, had to announce a $750 million fine for inappropriately using data that had been collected in one context and used in another. And we're very comfortable. We've been operating that space in the public sector in a long time, so it's kind of interesting to see the private sector catch up. But again, it's this balance we're constantly operating in. What is the cost? Or sorry, what is the cost and what is the benefit? And how do we start to even the scales a little bit? What are the ways that we can make the benefit easier to get to and reduce the cost or the potential risk of sharing that data? The good news is that there are a couple of things that are being done to help push that scale. So one of them is an emphasis around the value of data and around the value of sharing data. And so on the slide here, you can see an extract from the Federal Data Strategy Framework. And the same thing is true in a lot of agencies. There's a real emphasis on using data to make decisions. So sharing data, bringing it together. And of course, there's the 10 principles. 3 of them are on using the data, and then 7 are on the privacy and protection of the data, so the responsible data. But the good news is people are starting to push up the imperative to share a little bit more and a little bit more explicitly. And so that part is coming up, and we're starting to see that more and more. And the challenge, though, is that in the public sector, we've been paying attention to the risks for a long time. We've been really, really careful on the risk side. And so there's all sorts of controls in place, and appropriately so, to ensure that data is not shared inappropriately. So everything we do in the federal space and really everywhere is governed by the Privacy Act, right? So what is the data What is it being collected for? Why are you using it in transparency? And then privacy impact assessments is a great example of how the government is explicitly thinking about that balance. For a given system, what is the data you're collecting? What is the data you're using? And what are the benefits for it? And do those benefits outweigh the risks? And civil liberties and civil rights lawyers are looking at that constantly to decide that, whether or not that balance is right. And even when you get through that and you start to talk about sharing data, there's all sorts of explicit constraints around sharing data, right? So interagency data use agreements, interagency memorandums of agreement or understanding that explicitly codify what data can be shared, for what purposes, under what authority, and to whom. And these are always point-to-point agreements, or typically point-to-point. And then the authorities to operate, right? So now that we've gotten through now it's allowed to be shared, we've made sure we've met all the policies. What explicitly are we going to do in our system? What are the ingress and egress points for the data? Let's explicitly say that and make sure that those are very well documented and cleared, and what data comes in and out and how we protect that data. Another example, I thought the introduction of the data marketplace from Databricks was really interesting, and again, a place where I think public sector has really been pushing forward, but with challenges in that. A lot of the data, in the pandemic, obviously, a lot of the data was just made public for everybody, vaccination rates, infection rates, things like that. But a lot of that data has to be shared point to point, has to have very explicit authorizations, and can only be shared with subsets. So some very unique use cases in the public space. But even though we have all the deliberate effort to bound risks and control risks, we are starting to see people, again, try to push up the value of sharing data. And the foundations of evidence-based policy making is a great example of that. And it really does two things in regards to that. First, it explicitly commands that people will use data to make policy decisions. So it defines the data that needs to be collected and the data and the uses. And then also it implores agencies to start to modernize their data infrastructure, start to make the changes that allow them to start to discover the uses and make the data sharing even easier. So with that, again, really this thinking about this trade-off, the hypothetical benefits and the potential risks and costs to getting that. I'm going to turn it over to Danny, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of the technical implementation concerns, some of the requirements that we need to think about as we're doing that, and some of the solutions that are available today to get through some of this balance and sort of right the ship a little bit.
Thanks, Dave. So Dave talked about the need to know, and I'm going to talk about sort of this transition to a need to share and a need to scale. And beyond that, the need to be successful. We've talked about issues that are critical to each of us in this room, things as simple as national security, no brainer. But we're talking about things that protect the way that we communicate, the way that we commute to work, the way that we protect ourselves from current and future pandemics. The government has a pretty critical mission. And so just taking into totality the span of influence and effect that this organization has and the assets under control and the people that they're working with and some of the unique propositions that we can approach from a data analytics standpoint. Think about just the Veterans Affairs, for instance. A single organization that has medical records for people from the day of enlistment until the day that they die. Like that is a unique data set that may not exist anywhere else. And so, with that in mind, I'm going to talk about some recommendations and foundations for success, things that we've seen when correctly applied and addressed, and things that are materializing in some ways today, and some of the gaps and how to close them. So, first and foremost, kind of foundation, you got to build a house on a stable foundation. We need a data platform with adequate storage and compute resources. It seems kind of funny to say that out loud and need to put it into words on a slide. But we have legacy systems that have been in existence for multiple decades at this point, and we're trying to approach problems that exceed the scale of what can be processed on commodity hardware. And so with the power of the cloud and multiple clouds at this point, we've got some new techniques and approaches and capabilities that we can bring to bear against these big problems. And so that's sort of the starting point, table stakes. then we've got to have a process for establishing governance. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's, I'm a CTO, this is a technical talk, but this is a cultural thing. This is, an actual giving someone the designation and authority to make a decision on what can be shared, under which circumstances, and why. And further, to take that beyond what historically has been this binary decision of yes or no, and get to more nuanced engagements and ways of evaluating information and saying, I can share this with these people for these reasons. I can share this if I redact these values for this purpose and this reason for this amount of time. Or if I put enough anonymization and protection of the individuals in this data set in place, I can start to use it for new purposes that were never even imagined or addressable. And so we get beyond what we can do with copies and what we can do with these finite rules and decisions made by one person and tracked in an MOU that got filed from one person emailing another, and we make a scalable framework for addressing these solutions and doing it across technologies, across data sets, and across environments and networks, and possibly even across agencies and organizations in and out of federal. So the next thing we need, and if anyone's got ideas on this, I know we're all hiring in this room, but a workforce with the appropriate skills and authority. Some of the ways that we address that are by lowering the burden, the bar. How do we make these, how do I allow somebody to come in and stand up a Spark cluster without having to know the ins and outs of every component that goes into the open source architecture that goes behind it? Luckily, people like Databricks have taken that mission on. But how do we bring these citizen data scientists and this data together in an environment that allows them to safely experiment, to do things with information that previously may not have been possible or may not have been cost sensible, and do that in a way where they're not worried about the ramifications of leaking information or potentially creating a spill. And finally, this is kind of down to brass tacks and tactics, but an authoritative place for the inputs that we need to make these decisions. So we need to know what are the policies that we are underneath and need to operate in accordance with. Who am I getting information to and from? And how do I know what capacity they're acting in? Just the dynamic environment that we're operating in. People change jobs, people change missions. They might just move from one project to the next. And if we're thinking about things in this attribute-based dynamic way, their accesses should change when those roles and responsibilities change. And oftentimes we see when that's implemented in a manual, stagnant, static process, those changes don't happen. I've gone into places and been on a list of names that I should no longer be on. And then finally, metadata. How do we do this in a scalable way? How do we do things where we're no longer requiring human curation and manual review of data sources, where data is effectively being sidelined as it's waiting to be reviewed and adjudicated? And how do we start to do things like classification with machine learning and pulling information from current existing authoritative external catalogs to be able to make these policy and protection decisions as data is coming into our system, so that we can onboard new data sets, bring it to the fight, and use it as quickly as possible. So here's just a couple of trends that we're starting to see, and I'll talk about this in the lens of technology, but I think it applies across a couple of different things. So, very concretely, there's been this massive shift towards distributed computing, the flexibility it provides, the cloud. This is kind of obvious. We've moved from scaling up, buying more expensive, exquisite hardware, or scaling out rather than scaling up, to leveraging multiple resources, spinning up, spinning down, doing it in a cost-effective way. And what we've seen with this is that more problems are getting approached. More data is coming into the problem space to come up with these solutions. And just like we've seen the separation of compute and storage in the virtually limitless storage solutions that we have from cloud providers, we're seeing this need to separate policy from platform. So this is something it's pretty important to Immuta, but it gets to the fact that we're no longer building siloed applications where decisions about who can do what with information are being made in hard-coded software-defined logic. We have applications, we have analytics, we have exploratory ad hoc queries, we have dashboards, all being driven by the same underlying information. And the farther we can get down in the stack and implement those policy decisions, the more ground we can cover, the more we can be assured that it's being consistently applied, centrally audited, and available for that type of analysis. And so we think that with that there's going to be multiple clouds, there's going to be multiple platforms. We're getting to hyper-specialized technologies to address unique problems. And if we can separate policy with platform, we can have that single policy that's adherent to the law that's driving the title, the authority, the regulation, but ensure that it's going to work regardless of where we're processing that data, who's using it, and why. Okay, this slide builds. So what we're seeing is that these data policies are becoming the roadblock to secure scaling. So because we don't know how to operate with confidence and assurance that we're handling information correctly, we're either not doing it at all, or we're waiting and hoping that somebody else will come in and take the risk for us. And so it's not a linear growth, it's an actual exponential growth. We're seeing that with more data sources coming available, whether they're commercially available, whether they're being open sourced and collected from open information, or whether they're actually derivative data products that have been created out of the fusion of data sources of our current and existing holdings. We have more data sources, more technologies, and that's not going to stop. And then we've got more rules. Dave talked about seeing different pop-ups here in California because of the CCPA, GDPR, with the breaches and the vulnerabilities and the way that mishandling of information is starting to leak into everyday life. I don't see that stopping anytime soon. And so you combine that with this explosion of data users. We've got new tools. We can have people who don't know how to write Python, who don't know how to run a Spark job, now bringing information into these low-code, no-code environments using BI tools, clicking and building dashboards, taking a dashboard and modifying it for another purpose. The data has become democratized, and the tools have lowered that barrier to the point where we now have more actors that have problems that they can address with the right technologies and the right rules around the information they have. So, at the end of the day, we need to make sure we're getting all the information that people should have to the right people at the right time, and nothing that they shouldn't have. Keeps going. So I talked a little bit about separation of policy from platform. Just to dig into that a little bit more, one of the things that we're seeing is that the data doesn't live in one place anymore. You're no longer going out and getting a license with one database vendor and your enterprise is standardized on that platform. You've got teams that are possibly geographically distributed, possibly working virtually, coming in with different skill sets, different requirements, different types of information. And so we don't have to shoehorn information into the decision, the tool that was put down from on high by the enterprise. We're starting to see people pick and choose based on the skills that they have, the problems they're solving, and the way that the information lends itself to being stored and queried. And the other thing that we're seeing is that these aren't static data sets. We're seeing information that's streaming, that's coming in faster than ever, that's coming from more places. Some of it's IoT driven, some of it's mobile computing, some of it's 5G and pervasive access to the internet. And some of it just comes from the fact that we're seeing value from information. So things that would have otherwise hit the cutting room floor or been ignored or thrown away because it was too expensive, we're now holding on to it, thinking that there may be unique insights that could be gleaned from that information that might do something as simple as shape our product development roadmap. Which button's never getting clicked in my system? Is there a lack of documentation? Is the functionality behind that button not useful? We can start to get these insights that drive every part of our organization. And in the case of industry, it's typically to drive profits, but in the government, it could be to operate more efficiently or save more money or save more lives. The other thing we're seeing is that I talked about this a little bit earlier, but we can't ensure that it's being consistently enforced. Some of this policy is being interpreted, written in one language, and hopefully they did it right, and hopefully they had unit tests to ensure that they did it right and continue to operate right, but we all know in reality that that's not how it works. So if we can define it once and get it at a low level, we can put guardrails in place, we can put continuous monitoring, continuing testing against it to ensure that it continues to operate as intended, and we can have it reviewed frequently enough and by people who aren't experts. You don't need to know every programming language under the sun in order to do a comprehensive audit. You can read these policies as if they were written in plain English. And then finally, back to that dynamicism, people don't stay in one job for their careers. particularly in the federal government. I think it's one of the unique things about being a federal employee is you get exposed to different types of missions. You move across directorates or parts of the organization, you do a rotation, and so there's this really good environment for getting a breadth of experience. But with that, the information you need and the information you should have changes. And so in the worst case, somebody's getting access to information they should no longer have and they misuse it for some reason. In the best case, somebody shows up for the job on day one, and instead of having to go through the checklist and find all the people that they need to talk to and figure out all the information they need to be successful, they show up and their data's in their workspace, and they can say, whether show databases, show tables, and it's everything that they need to be successful in that role today. And it might be different tomorrow, but it's being done automatically. And so some of this all builds into what NIST defined as attribute-based access control. And what this helps us get to is addressing a future state where technologies are going to continue to be rapidly evolving. They're going to come in, they're going to come out, they're going to change. Users are going to come in and go and change roles and responsibilities, and with that, their accesses need to adapt. And then data is only going to continue to increase. New data sources, more information, denser data sources. And I think we're going to see more laws and different ads in different places. But without this system to enforce policy, we're just constantly going to be playing catch up. And we're going to either be accepting risk and potentially misusing information, or we're going to be missing out on opportunities that could help us with whatever it is that our mission requires. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Dave.
And so we've had the opportunity to work together and implement this type of approach in a number of different agencies. And when we do it, what we see at the end of the day is that we've enabled much more effective inter and interagency data sharing. So somebody comes in, they have access to the data they need on day one. Data is going to move outside of an agency boundary. The agency trusts that the policies are enforced because they can be discovered, they can be audited, and the data can be seen, and they know that all the data policies are stored in one place. Another great benefit is the speed to add new data. So a new data set comes in, it needs to be shared. If the policies have already been taken from the legalese and put into schemas, then you can really quickly enforce that same policy on the new data. You say this is the same type of data, it has to fit this policy, and we're allowed to share it under these circumstances, and you can go off. The other incredibly important piece is clarity about who has access to what data. So our clients care not only that the data isn't being shared inappropriately, but they want to make sure, they want to be able to audit, and they can go back and see who has access to what data, and what type of individuals have access to what data. What are the actual, not just the names of the people, but why does this person have access? What are their attributes, and what is the data attribute that allows them to have access? And the last thing that I think is really important there at the end is, Danny described, there's a huge proliferation of data stores. The data stores are being stood up for multiple different use cases. Data is moving from place to place. And even today, in this session, one of the major themes about Lakehouse was the need for different types of data stores, right? You have your business intelligence, and as you move up, as they talked about repeatedly on the AI maturity curve, you need different types of data accesses. And that was one look, and we see that increasingly. You think about transactional data as well. You do get direct access to the transactional stores because that's the fastest place to get access. So by pulling out policy, separating it from persistence, it allows you to pick the right persistence engine as long as you can enforce the policy there. So with that, I don't know if there are any questions. Be happy to answer any that might come in.
Hey, Danny and Dave. I had a question pertaining to what you feel the balance is between those like applications and persistence engines like Databricks and specific data governance software like Commuta to do the data governance. Because what we've seen at this conference is, like, well as technologies like Commuta that's meant specifically to do all the data governance, there's also more maturing on like the database application side to do that, right? So what is like the balance between them? Should it be like a complete overlap with data governance, or is it more like a Venn diagram where at a macro level, one software does this, at a micro level, another software does the other side of the data governance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a trade space. I would never go and recommend that we immediately start refactoring every application that's out there. But I think as we start to build new tools and we start to look at the architectural components that are in our system today that we know about and the tools that are available for us, we can start to think about things differently and take a more scalable, long-term look at where we want to put that logic. Do we want to write it in Java? Do we want to write it in JavaScript? Do we want to write it in Go? Do we want to write it in C or Python or you name it, whatever's next? Or do we want to come out with some sort of external service that can become a decision service that's interoperable? Maybe it's a set of microservices. Maybe it's a set of embeddable components that can be a part of your application. And think about how we can ensure that consistency and the time it's going to take off of the people who are actually implementing and validating and assessing that policy, and say, is that worth an architectural refresh? Like, is there a new paradigm in application and analytic development? And do we continue to see pervasive adoption of data-driven technologies where the benefits are worth, taking a new look at how we make those decisions?
In any of your efforts, have you run into cases where the compliance checkers are so risk averse that even when you put a simple, straightforward system in their hands, you can't get them to implement in it because of the risk of committing to a specific way of implementing the compliance guidance?
I've got some thoughts. You want to start?
So the short answer is yes. We've definitely run into cases like that. Generally speaking, if we have traceability from the primary source, right? So here's the data use agreement that allows us to share this data. Here's how we've interpreted that line in the data or in the data use agreement, and here's how we've implemented in policy, and here's the actual data elements that are being shared. Usually, if we get to that level of explicitness, people will understand. But sometimes people just say, I don't care what the data use agreement says. I'm not doing it because of X, Y, Z. So there's always the human factor, but we've had pretty good success where we've gotten down to that level of transparency. But there are always things that you can't get over. But anything to add?
Yeah. The only thing I would add, and it's a slightly different approach or different perspective, is that, of course, we've come up against the compliance checkers or the scanners or whatever it is, but like part of it is I know what I'm going to come up against, and if I've proactively assessed myself under that compliance checklist that they're going to use, and I can show them, like, I know what you're looking for, I checked myself against it, here's what I found and how I addressed it, and start to build trust and rapport and show positive intent. It doesn't happen immediately, but I have seen over time that compliance, that eventually they start to kind of realize that you're fighting the same fight, that you've got the same positive intentions, and that you're taking security seriously. And if you can show it to them in a way that sort of co-opts them into the solution, that the next time they may be a little more accepting or willing to move things faster, or they start to realize that this group really knows what they're doing. Let's give them a little more room to operate.
All right. Let's give a big thank you to our speakers.
Great job.